Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for Inside the Mind of the Plan Giving Donor. Market Smart and Professor Russell James of Texas Tech University have teamed up today to bring you a presentation on neuroimaging and philanthropic decision making. Just to let you know how today is going to work, we're going to have a 45-minute presentation from Professor James, and then we're going to have a 15-minute question and answer session at the end. If you have a question that you'd like to ask Professor James, please use the question function on the GoToWebinar control panel that you should see on your screen. If you are using social media, our Twitter handle is Greg Market Smart, named for our CEO, Greg Warner. And we ask that you use hashtag RJWebinar to reference today's presentation. So just to tell you a little bit about us here at Market Smart today, we are an interactive agency, and we have both software solutions and marketing services to help fundraisers get more major gifts today and more planned gifts in the future. And our guest speaker today is Professor Russell James of Texas Tech University. He is an associate professor and also the director of charitable financial planning. He studied law at the University of Missouri, where he was recognized for his work in gift and estate taxation planning. He holds a PhD in consumer economics from the University of Missouri, and his dissertation was on charitable giving. He worked as the director of Plan Giving at Central Christian College in Moberly, Missouri for 6 years, and then served as the president for 5 years, where he oversaw all fundraising. Today, he researches neuroimaging and uses this technology to better understand philanthropic decision-making. So without further ado, I'm going to let Professor James take over. All right, Professor James.
Okay, thanks. So just a minute here while we get the screens working in the right order. And once you're seeing the screen there, let's see. Okay.
All right, I'm seeing it. Thank you.
All right, very good. Well, thanks so much for joining us today. Again, this is Professor Russell James from Texas Tech University, and I want to take a few minutes to share with you some of the latest research findings that we've uncovered in trying to gain a deeper understanding of how people make charitable bequest decisions. And so today we're going to be looking at both neuroimaging results and experimental psychology results to understand a bit more about how these processes work. So the way that this webinar will be divided is into two parts. For the first section, what I want to do is share with you some of the results, the first section coming from our neuroimaging lab, and the second section coming from other experimental psychology research. And I want to share these with you as information that's good to know. It's information that forms a framework for how we can understand how people make charitable bequest decisions. But I don't want to leave it just in the ivory tower theory realm. I want to spend the second half of the webinar talking about how we can use these pieces of information that we've gained from research to actually change the way or improve the way that we raise funds in the area of charitable bequest giving. Now, I will make an apology up front, as I'm an attorney, and I know some of the other folks online are also attorneys. I do use the term bequest here in the vernacular to cover all sorts of estate planning decision makings rather than its more formal sense. So let's start with the first idea from research that we want to learn. That first idea is the concept that from neuroimaging research, it appears that bequest decision-making emphasizes visualized autobiography brain regions. And I want to talk a bit about why we say that and what that means. To begin with, there is a clear behavioral distinction between charitable giving and charitable bequest giving. And that clear distinction is that even people who engage in a lot of charitable giving over the age of 50, less than 10% of those individuals have a charitable estate plan. So there is a substantial gap in behavior between these two kinds of activities. So knowing that, the process for this first stage of research was to be able to understand what is the cognitive or neural difference between charitable bequest decision making and other kinds of charitable decision making, such as current giving or volunteering decision making. So what we did was to have people make these type of decisions while they were in an MRI scanner, so that we could see how does the brain process these types of decisions differently. The just a second here. Sorry, I'm missing a slide there. Just sorry about the delay there. Let me fix this. So what I want to show you here is the, okay, there we go. All right. Okay, apologize for that slow down there. Okay, so what I'm going to show you here is I'm going to show you the images that we got from having people in the scanner, and what we're looking at here is which parts of the brain are more activated for charitable bequest decisions as compared to charitable decisions involving volunteering or current giving. And so what this is a combination of all of our participants and basically stacking those neural images together. And what you're seeing on this screen is essentially a flight through the brain. We're starting at the nose and we're moving back through the brain to look at areas of significant activation. Now, as you can see, as the image progresses, we go back through the eyes and then towards the middle of the brain. And one of the things I want to point out here is that after we get all the way through the front half of the brain, we've seen no distinctions. We've seen no significant differences. So what that's telling us is that we're not seeing the differences between these activations in the prefrontal cortex area, which is your math, your rational cognition parts of the brain. So the differences actually occur elsewhere. And it's not until we start getting towards the back of the brain that we are seeing the initial differences. In other words, what is more active with bequest decision making. That first difference comes, and it's the first major area that you will see of color in this image. That first difference comes in an area known as the precuneus. And then the second difference comes at the very back of the brain in an area that is centered in what's referred to as the lingual gyrus. So that is the image for what the special regions of the brain that were associated with bequest decision making were. And the next slide, for any of you who are budding neuroimagers, here's a little bit more of the technical results of that. Essentially, we compared bequest decision-making to giving and bequest decision-making to volunteering, and also in a combined factor in all three of those analyses, we got the same results. So what does this mean? Well, the lingual gyrus area is part of the visual system. We know that damage can result in losing the ability to dream. It's a visualization area, so think of internal visualization. The first area of activation that you saw in that image was called the precuneus. Now, this has been called the mind's eye because it's used to take a third-person perspective on oneself. So if we put these two concepts together, the concept of visualization and the concept of third-person perspective on the self, it produces this idea of a visualized autobiography. Now, this is not a new idea from this research. There's been previous neuroimaging research that has found these same two areas activated in some other circumstances. In one study where older adults were shown photographs from across their life, both the precuneus and lingual gyrus activation occurred when they were able to vividly relive those events in the photographs, but not where the scenes were only vaguely familiar. So this is suggesting to us that when people are thinking about their life stories, as in this previous research, that in fact we get activation from these visualized autobiography areas. There's been other studies that show that both of these regions are simultaneously activated when people are mentally traveling back in time or recalling autobiographical personal events. This is not just something from the neuroimaging results, though. We do, in fact, see this concept of autobiography in practice. Here, quoting from Claire Routley's dissertation in 2011, where she interviewed planned bequest donors, and she summed up how they described their motivation for including different charities as this. Indeed, when discussing which charities they had chosen to remember, there was a clear link with the life narratives of many respondents. So that first piece of information I'd like for you to keep in mind is that idea that bequest decision-making emphasizes visualized autobiography brain regions. The second idea I'd like for you to keep in mind is that bequests to friends and family members engage memory and emotion brain regions more than charitable bequests do. So in this experiment, we had 36 participants, and we also attempted to increase the realism of the decision making, but this is different. The first experiment, we were looking at bequest decision making as compared to current giving or volunteering. Now we're looking at bequest decisions of different types, friends, family, and charities. So what the participants in this experiment saw was that at the end of the session, a legally valid last will and testament would be mailed to them at no charge. To help you design your plan, we need to ask about some of your desires and preferences, and they were asked about percentages and dollar amounts and specific personal property items they wanted to go to each of these three groups. So this is intended to be a bit more realistic, at least as realistic as we can get when people are actually in an MR scanner. So the results from this is that bequest to friends and family member more heavily involve brain regions of emotion and of memory, and the difference was a bit stronger for females than males. So this is not a shocking finding by any means, but I want you to keep it in mind because some of our other experimental results will show how this can be useful. So that second piece is to keep in mind that bequest to friends and family member engage memory and emotion brain regions more than charitable bequests. Now I want to shift from the neuroimaging results to some experimental psychology results. And those give us a framework for how people deal with death-related decisions. And first we're going to look at this reaction of avoidance, because the first stage defense to death reminders, bequest planning being one of them, is avoidance. So let's talk a bit about that first stage defense and what that looks like. The unfortunate reality is this. Regardless of terminology or packaging, if we engage people in estate planning, we are helping them to plan for their own death. This is a strong reminder of the reality of one's own mortality, but it turns out there's been a lot of experimental research done that has identified consistent reactions to mortality reminders. So just a quote to summarize what a lot of these findings have uncovered, it's the idea that the initial reaction to death-related thoughts is to push those thoughts out of mind. It's a relatively rational, threat-focused cognitive maneuver, and the idea is to push these thoughts out of consciousness. So what does this avoidance look like in experiment and in real life? Well, it looks like these 5 Ds. It looks like being distracted. Well, I'm too busy to think about that right now. Or differentiate. It doesn't apply to me now because I exercise or have good health. Or to deny. These worries about mortality just simply don't apply to me. Or very common is to delay. Well, I definitely plan to think about all of this estate planning stuff, but I'm going to do it later. Or finally, to depart, to simply stay away from that reminder. I want to now turn to an example that I think has some applicability for bequest planning, but it's from a little bit different field, and that is the decision of organ donation. I think there's a commonality because organ donation is a decision you can make that benefits other people. It doesn't have any cost to you, but unfortunately, it's a decision that has a high level of mortality salience. It reminds us of death. So what is the most common response to an organ donation request? Is it yes? Is it no? Or is it I don't want to think about it? Well, if we look at this next set of results published in Science magazine a few years ago, if we looked at these first 4 countries, we would say, given the effective consent rates to having a leaving an organ donation, that the answer is no. Most people don't want to donate organs. However, if instead we looked at this other set of European countries, where we get effective consent percentage rates that are over 99% in many cases, then we would take that evidence to say, well, it appears that yes, people do want to donate their organs. So what's going on here? What is causing this inconsistency in results? Well, the inconsistency in results is driven by the countries in gold are ones that have opt-in systems. That is, you check the box to say, yes, I want to donate organs. And the countries in blue have opt-out systems. That is, you check the box to say, no, I don't want to donate organs. So what we can take from this is that from the countries on the left, people don't want to opt in to organ donation. And what we can take from the countries on the right is that people don't want to opt out of organ donation. So if we combine both of those realities, what it tells us is people don't want to think about these topics. Now, does that have any applicability for charitable bequest decision making? I think it does. When we look at people over the age of 50, about 6% have charitable plans. About 38% either weren't asked when they were planning, or they were asked and said no because they have plans without a charitable component. But the majority of people simply have no planning documents. That is, the majority of people are answering this question with, I don't want to think about it. So that third thing to keep in mind is that the first stage defense to death reminders is avoidance. The final piece from research that I want to share with you today is the idea that when avoidance doesn't work, the second stage defense to death reminders is to seek symbolic immortality that supports one's in-group community. Now, I know that's a bunch of professor words all put together there, but I want to make that a bit more practical. So the reality is that that first stage defense of avoidance is something that people employ consistently, but it doesn't always work. External realities sometimes break through that first stage avoidance defense. It might be illness or injury or advancing age or the death of someone close to the person, or someone like me gets you to intentionally plan for your death through estate planning. Whatever it is that makes that happen, avoidance doesn't always work. When avoidance doesn't work, the second stage defense to mortality reminders is symbolic immortality, a form of autobiographical heroism. This is the idea that some part of oneself, one's name, family, community, achievements, values, goals, is going to persist after death. Now, for those of you who are interested in the psychological background of this, you're more than welcome to read some of the original manuscripts from the 1960s and the 1920s by Ernest Becker, Otto Rank, and some other Freudian-related folks about why all of this is. But I just want to summarize for you the basic idea and to tell you that I'm interested in this not so much for all of the psychological theory, but because of the actual experimental results that are showing the strength of this model. And so what I want to suggest is that symbolic immortality, the idea of leaving a legacy that's going to be remembered, can be thought of as the attic of this house of autobiographical heroism. That requires the foundation of one's community and values that provide a framework of meaningfulness. So let me share with you now some of the actual experimental results, and I'll just run through a bunch of them that shows how strongly this affects people. When people are reminded of their own mortality, it changes their preferences and decisions in a number of ways, many of which show this increased desire for symbolic immortality and autobiographical heroism. So, for example, it increases their desire for fame. It increases the interest in naming a star after oneself. It increases the perception of one's past significance, the likelihood of describing positive improvements when writing an autobiographical essay, and the perceived accuracy of a positive personality profile of oneself. All of this in this category of what we might call autobiographical heroism. But it's not just the case that we see that happening. We also see an increased allegiance to one's community and community values. So, for example, death reminders increase giving among Americans to U.S. charities, but they don't increase giving among Americans to foreign charities. They increase negative ratings by Americans of anti-United States essays. They increase negative ratings of foreign soft drinks. So apparently your taste buds become more jingoistic when you're reminded of mortality as well. They even increased the predicted number of local NFL football team wins. Death reminders increased ethnic identity among Hong Kong Chinese and German preference for the German mark versus the euro. They increase acceptance of negative stereotypes of residents of other cities or other nations. They've been shown to increase support by Israeli participation of military action against Iran. And death reminders also increase support by Iranian students for martyrdom attacks against the U.S. They increase willingness of English participants to die or self-sacrifice for England. Dutch agreement with art opinions given by Dutch but not by Japanese, voting for female candidates by females but not males, and the list could go on and on. But the ultimate result is this attachment to community and values. The final result I want to share with you from experimental psychology is one that was dubbed the Ebenezer Scrooge effect. And this is the result that if you bring someone into the lab who is psychologically more self-focused, after the mortality reminders, those individuals increased their ratings of charitable organizations following mortality reminders. Now, why is this a big deal? Well, this is something that goes a little way to explain why again and again organizations share stories about having received significant bequest gifts from individuals who never made charitable gifts during life, never volunteered to the organization during life. The reason is the environment in which people make bequest decisions is a high death reminder environment. It is a high mortality salience environment. And because of this environment, people's preferences are different in that environment, as we see from this research as well. Okay, so that's the last piece of the research background and information that I'd like for you to keep in mind that I think can form a framework for how we think about these charitable bequest decision-making processes. So that's all well and good, but how do we use this in the real world to try to improve results in bequest fundraising? Well, the first suggestion I want to make that links into this idea of visualized autobiography is to suggest telling life stories of donors who will live beyond their death through their bequest giving. And I'm not just telling you this because I think it's off the cuff, maybe a good idea. This is actually something that we've recently tested. What we did is we tested different marketing messages with 9 different groups and a total of actually 4,500 individuals within these groups. And this is, give me just a second. I apologize for the delay here. I am okay. There we go. I was working on edits all morning and realized that I've gotten a bit older presentation here. So once again, accept my apologies there. Okay, let me flip through that. All right. So this is actually the latest results. I knew the number was off there because we had run a few more of these. Okay, so we were testing different marketing messages with 11 different groups. I have some excuse of being an absent-minded professor, really. I do this sort of thing all the time. We had 4,500 individuals, a bit over that total, and we tested 40 different charities. And this is what we were looking at. We were looking at the comparison between their answers to these 2 questions on a 100-point scale. First, they were asked, if you were asked in the next 3 months, what's the likelihood you might give money to a particular organization? Of course, we tested 40 different organizations. And then we were asked, if you signed a will in the next 3 months, what is the likelihood you might leave a bequest gift to that organization? The reason that we care about these 2 questions is that this will show us if there is a gap between willingness to make a current gift and willingness to make a bequest gift. And the reason the gap is important is because, you know, some people are just not charitable. And so we're not too concerned about those individuals. If they don't care about the organization, we're not worried about it. We're more concerned about the gap between people's willingness to give currently and their willingness to leave a bequest. So what did we find? Well, what we found was that respondents were more willing to give money than to leave a bequest for every single organization. Now, these are the 40 organizations that we tested with that research, but the reality is this is a universal finding. So chances are, even if your organization doesn't appear on this list, the reality is that your organization likely has this gap as well, where people are more willing to give than to leave a bequest. So what we then did is to try to test different marketing messages to see which marketing message would affect this gap. And so what we did is we broke the groups up into different groups. Some of them received no marketing messages at all. And with that group, we had an average gap of about 10.25 points on this 100-point scale. In other words, that's the gap between people's willingness to give and their willingness to leave a bequest. Well, first we started with this message about spendthrift heirs. It's the idea of basically arguing, look, the statistics show that a lot of these inheritances are just spent really quickly, and therefore it may make sense to leave money to something that's going to last longer. And it had a little bit of an effect. We got maybe a 0.75 point reduction in the gap for the group that received that message. Then we tried another message, a social norms message, and basically this is the idea where we presented them with a lot of information that this kind of charitable bequest inclusion was something that is typically included by Americans. It's the right thing to do. Everybody agrees with it, and we got a little bit more of a hit from that one. And we were able to reduce maybe by about 1.5 points, and slightly better if we put both messages together for the same group. We then did a different set of interventions for separate groups. This is using the Leave a Legacy stories, which you can get from the PPP National website. We got permission to test these. In some cases, we tested them with our own images. In some cases, we tested just pure text. There wasn't really a significant difference between the way they were delivered, but we got our biggest results so far in terms of reducing that gap with the Leave a Legacy stories. Then we did something different. We took those Leave a Legacy stories and we changed them just slightly so that they were talking about living donors. So for example, one of the stories starts with school janitor Lester Holmes died in 1992. That story becomes school janitor Lester Holmes signed his will today. And then as much as possible, the rest of the story was the same. What we found with this is that the living bequest donor stories had the biggest impact in reducing the gap between willingness to leave a bequest and willingness to give. Now, I will tell you the reason that we had 11 different groups for this testing was because the first time I got this result, I didn't believe it. I thought the deceased bequest donor stories would be better, and so I tested it again. And the living bequest donor stories won again, so I tested it again. And again, and you can see why we have 11 different groups. Finally, I gave up because every single time the living bequest donor stories outpulled the deceased bequest donor stories. This actually fits with what we're seeing from the neuroimaging lab. Bequest decision making is like visualizing the final chapter of one's own biography. So it makes sense that sharing biographical stories of other individuals is one of the most powerful interventions. So that's the first suggestion, telling life stories of donors who will live beyond their death through their bequest giving. The second suggestion relates to the second finding, and this is the idea of reminding donors of life story connections of friends or family with the charity or cause, and then to provide tribute bequest opportunities. We know that the emotion and memory associated with a living or deceased loved one is stronger than that associated with the charity by itself. So what we wanted to explore is it possible to attach that emotion and memory of the family member or friend to a cause that represents them? Now, this is not a new idea. Going back to some of Claire Outley's research, when people are interviewed about why they included different charities, and this is from the UK, so the organizations will be slightly different, we see that people make reference often to family member connections. Here's a quote: "There's the Youth Hostel Associations where my wife and I met. My father died of cancer, and so I've supported them ever since he died." Or from another one, "The reason I've selected Help the Aged, it was after my mother died, and I just thought she'd been in a care home for probably 3 or 4 years, and I wanted to help the elderly. I've also supported things like cancer research because people I've known have died, and an animal charity as well. I had a couple of cats." So how did we test this? Well, in those previous 4,500 individuals who were taking this survey, we, after they either didn't receive a marketing message or they received whatever marketing message they had, then we asked them whether they had, in some cases deceased or in other cases living, friend or family member who would have appreciated their support of a particular kind of nonprofit, and gave them some examples, such as a cancer research organization, such as American Cancer Society, MD Anderson, and so forth. If so, please state your relationship to them and write at least 25 words describing their interest in or connection with the cause. And then we asked them the bequest question again, except now it's slightly different. It was their willingness to leave a bequest gift honoring a deceased friend or family member. So this is a tribute or honoring gift. So the question is, did that change the results? And the answer is yes, it changed it, and it changed it dramatically so. So what we're looking at here is the increase in their willingness to leave a charitable bequest when they were reminded of a friend or family member connection. So what we see is a strong result overall, and an even stronger result for the older participants who were filling out this survey. Now, these numbers are very important because if you remember, with the previous life story messages, we were able to get that gap down to a 4 or 6 point gap. Now, when we add to those individuals these reminders for those who had friends or family member connection, we were actually able to completely eliminate the bequest versus giving intention gap, meaning that people had a higher willingness to leave this kind of a bequest than their initial willingness to leave a gift to the charity. Now, a short side note here, this is an intervention that worked great with bequest intentions. It didn't work that great with intentions to leave a current memorial or tribute gift. So do keep that in mind. So how do we implement these kind of results? Well, I want to borrow something from my friend Phyllis Friedman, who is president of Smart Giving, and this is how she's incorporated it in some of the response cards for bequest offerings. And that's just the idea of, if they have included a gift, to give the opportunity to say that that bequest gift is in honor of or in memory of someone. It's a no-cost way to remind people that they can make these kinds of gifts, and may give a good reason for why they may want to reveal it ahead of time so that the charity knows that it is a tribute or a memorial gift. So that's the second suggestion, to remind donors of life story connections with friends or family member with the charity or cause to provide tribute bequest opportunities. Let's go to the third suggestion, and this is the idea of communicating bequest information through mixed packaging. Now, before we get into this, I want you to understand that what I am talking about here is when you are communicating to a broad audience. This is an audience that has not been pre-qualified, that is still going to be in that avoidance stage, as most people are, until they get to the stage of wanting to actually engage in planning. So if we are trying to communicate with a widespread audience, we have to realize that for many people, bequest decision making is emotionally aversive. When we go out and present something like a seminar on estate planning, we see nothing aversive about that. But here's the difference. When I am presenting a seminar about estate planning, I am talking about your death, which doesn't bother me all that much. But For people going to an estate planning seminar, it is a seminar about their death, which we know is generally aversive. So how do we deal with avoiding this kind of avoidance response to the fact that we're talking about a death-related topic? Well, I want to suggest that we can do that by using mixed packaging. If we realize that the topic is subconsciously aversive, we may consider combining or masking it with more attractive topics to sidestep the initial avoidance response. This is the spoonful of sugar that makes the medicine go down. Well, how might that work if we're going for a general broad audience? Well, perhaps instead of a seminar on charitable estate planning, we'd want to do a seminar on stories from the front lines, the cause and people who make it happen, where we talk about stories about the nonprofit work, but also the support of plan giving donors who have made that work possible, and some examples of how they did that. Perhaps instead of doing a standard seminar on charitable estate planning, we could do a seminar on new ways to save more taxes when you give. Not that taxes is the major motivation for our people, but it is not an offensive topic. It is not one that's going to respond with avoidance. And we can then encompass a wide range of plan giving topics, including estate planning, and we've income qualified our audience fairly well. The idea here is if we engage in mixed messaging and we manage avoidance, we may put these messages in general interest donor publications, but we might not do a donor-wide mailing labeled as estate planning unless we're mailing to people who have been qualified in such a way that we already think they're past the avoidance level. What's a good way to do this? Well, one approach is to use a broad survey to both learn and to teach. How might you do that? Well, let's say, for example, that this is for a university. We might have a survey that includes questions such as, which of the following areas of the nonprofit do you consider to be the most important, so that you can find out what people care about, and then you can also, within that context, convey some information. So, for example, here I've used the example, were you aware that for those over age 55, donating the future inheritance rights to your home or farmland creates an immediate income tax deduction of 70% or more? And this, of course, is the remainder interest in home or farmland if your organization happened to be supporting that at that particular time. But, of course, you could include any kind of information in here that was relevant to your context. When we think about charitable bequest decision-making, I think it is important to break it down as a three-step process. The first stage, and the stage that most people are in all of the time, is the I don't want to think about it stage. Now, of course, what we want to do is we want to move people from I don't want to think about it to yes. And here the mixed packaging idea presents information in non-death related contexts. But it turns out that in charitable estate planning, moving people to yes is not the biggest hurdle. The biggest hurdle is moving people from yes to now, because now has that high death-related sense to why do I need to plan now? That's the real question. Why now? If I am not going to die tomorrow, why not deal with all of this unpleasantness later? Now, I will tell you that you may be very well tempted to answer the question of why now with a comment like this. Well, you might get hit by a truck tomorrow. Now, we know that's true. But I can tell you that everything from the experimental psychology results suggests to us that this is a bad argument. People will resist acting in response to this argument because this is an argument that depends upon their own personal mortality, and you're going to run up against the avoidance response. So what do we do to move people from yes to now without hitting that avoidance response? I want to suggest is coming up with a creative way to attach a non-death related negative outcome to planning later, or if you'd like to frame it, a positive outcome to planning now, something that's non-death related. Well, what could this look like? Well, maybe we have a matching grant that will pay 10% of planned bequest up to $10,000 per donor signed before November 1st. That's a motivation, because if you do it later, there's going to be no match. And if you already have a donor who is already intending to give a significant amount of money, it shouldn't take too much convincing to have them give it to the organization in this challenge kind of framework. Or perhaps simply, our campaign to reach 100 planned bequests ends in 3 months. Won't you consider joining these others? So if they do it later, then the issue is they're going to be left out of the group. Now, you can get creative here. You can offer whatever it is for anyone who signs up for an appointment tonight only, as long as it's attached to immediate action, but it's an opportunity that you lose for later action. So, for example, when I used to give seminars, there would be an opportunity for a free consultation or a free simple will, but only if you signed up on the night of the presentation. It was not an ongoing opportunity because we had to motivate action for now. How else might you motivate action in a non-death related context? Well, you might say the 75/20 rates went up, so if you don't sign the remainder interest deed in the next 30 days, your deduction is going to drop. So if you do it later, you're going to get a lower deduction. Or we could flip that around and say the 75/20 rates went down, and if you don't fund the CRT or charitable gift annuity in the next 30 days, then your deduction is going to drop. So whether they go up or they go down, if it gives us a reason to attach a negative outcome to doing something later, we can move forward that process. And moving forward that process may be something as simple as creating an appointment. Okay, so it looks like we're set up for a follow-up appointment to review things on March 6th. So there's the social stigma if we come back on March 6th and you haven't done anything or you have to cancel the appointment. That's the social stigma that I have to deal with if I do it later. So we're attaching that negative outcome to planning later, which is exactly what we want to do. Maybe we just want to convince people that they're going to be a bad example for others. People really take their cue from leaders like you. Your action would motivate many of them to act. We might even do this in terms of filling out a commitment to plan card. This is the idea of, say, for example, to show a strong leadership commitment in this plan giving push, we want to announce 100% participation for whatever the group is. By the fall banquet, can we count you in? And then people can check mark, I commit to an estate plan with a gift to the organization within 6 months, yes, no, or already completed. Why do we do it this way? Well, that within 6 months means that it's not going to be all that offensive because I'm avoiding it and yeah, I'll get to it later. That's not a problem. Now, that commitment by itself won't do anything to get people to act, but what it does do is it gives you the opportunity to come back and say, how's it going? Can I check to see how the process has been going? Okay. So that's the third suggestion. The fourth suggestion that I want to make to you, and the last one today, is to consider providing bequest giving opportunities with permanence. Again, if we go back to the psychological model, permanence is psychologically attractive. People are looking for something reflecting the person's life story, their community and values, something that will live beyond them. I want to share with you some results from that study that we did with the 4,500 respondents. In those surveys, we gave people an opportunity to answer whether they would prefer their gift to be immediately spent to advance the cause of the charity or to establish a permanent fund. And what we found was that for those who expressed a preference difference, they, by more than a 2-to-1 margin, wanted more permanence for bequest gifts than for current gifts. We see this in another piece of research that I think is really interesting. In this research, the same charitable organization was described in 2 different ways to different groups, either as meeting the immediate needs of the people or as creating lasting improvements that would benefit people in the future. And the individuals who were participating had the chance to win $1,000. One of them would win $1,000, and they were asked, would you be willing to pre-commit some of those winnings to this charity in case you happen to win? And it turns out that they were more willing to give to the immediate focus charity in the normal group, but the other group was actually reminded of their death, went through mortality salience first, and that group, the results flipped, and they were more willing to give to the permanent focus charities. This may be part of the reason why we see organizational age can help both its perceived stability and the donor age profile in terms of what percentage of income comes from bequest giving. If you're working for an organization that is newer or less stable, perhaps consider marketing permanent funds that are managed by a large financial institution or a large community foundation to try to borrow those feelings of strength and stability. And then finally, I want you to think about this idea. And that's the idea of considering developing permanent giving opportunities for the mid-level bequest donors. Now, people who are high-level donors, they can readily think of ways that they could leave a gift that would have a permanent impact, whether it's building a building or doing something else that's very large. But I want to be able to expand that to incorporate more mid-level donors and give them opportunities in a bequest context to make permanent gifts. Now, whatever your organization is, you have to think through what that might look like. That might be scholarships or lectureships or annual performances or perpetual child sponsorship or perpetual rescue pet sponsorship, memorial wall of heroes, whatever that permanent opportunity is. And I would even suggest limiting this opportunity just to legacy donors to emphasize the specialness of it and to avoid pulling from current giving. The reason we want to emphasize this with legacy donors is that we see a strong preference for permanent opportunities having a permanent impact when it comes to bequest charitable giving that we don't see with current charitable giving. So that's the last suggestion on how to use the framework, and that is to provide bequest giving opportunities with permanence. So within this framework, I want to suggest to you that there are a couple of ways that you can use it. Yes, I think the suggestions that I've given to you are ones that have been borne out by the research results that are effective. Now, I will tell you that what we're doing right now is we're scanning people who have been reminded of this friend and family member connection under the tribute bequest to understand why is it that it's making such a big difference and how does the brain think about it differently. So perhaps look forward to, in the spring, seeing the results from that when all of the data analysis is done. But I think it's useful if we keep in mind those 4 core ideas that we have a deeper understanding and a deeper framework of how these decisions are made, because if we have that deeper framework and understanding, then you can take that information and apply it to your situation and come up with your own unique situations and responses that work for your situation, but take advantage of understanding those underlying processes and how that works. So I'm out of time at this point. I'll turn it back over and see if there have been any questions. And then since I can't see the questions, I think those will be shared with me and we can go from there. So I'll stop here for a moment and see if there's any questions.
Thanks so much, Russell. We have had some questions submitted, and thank you to those who have sent them in. One of the first questions that came in was someone asking if you have any suggestions for presenting an opportunity for planned giving within a comprehensive campaign with either annual and or special gifts.
So the what I would suggest is within the context of a comprehensive campaign, if you are communicating to an audience that's not pre-qualified, and by pre-qualified I mean these are not people who have checked the box and said, yes, I'm interested in estate planning now, help me with it, okay? If we're just dealing with the general audience, then the nature of our message is one that needs to take into account this tendency to avoid this kind of information. So I think you want to mix it together with other things. You don't have to have communication that's completely focused just on estate planning. It can be as part of the overall campaign. There's a lot of different ways that we're using to accomplish our campaign goals, and just putting that in as a piece. So you sort of get in with the quick reminder, putting it in the consciousness of people, and then being able to follow up with individuals at a later point. One other approach is to consider having a deadline, having a goal for a certain number of new charitable bequest commitments, so that you can also, as you're reporting progress for the campaign as a whole, you can report progress to, let's say you have a goal of 100 new bequest commitments. You can report progress towards that goal at the same time. You could have a celebration dinner at the end for those who have participated in it, and it gives you a reason when you are going out to talk to donors. It gives you a reason to bring this topic up. You can simply say, we're also going through this campaign. We're about halfway through our goal of having 100 new charitable bequest gifts that are planned. And if we can reach this goal by January 1st, then the plan is to have, the celebration dinner or whatever. And, if you would be interested in participating in that, let me know. So it's basically a reason, it's a pretext, it's an excuse, but it works well with some of the other campaign goals that you can track, and you can communicate how you're doing in your progress, because by communicating how you're doing in your progress towards that goal, you're communicating the idea that, that this is something that people should think about, and most importantly, they should think about it before the deadline. Got to put a deadline on that piece of the campaign, as you have with all other pieces of the campaign.
Great. All right, another question that came in was, do printed lists of Legacy Society members in publications have an impact on persuading others to leave planned gifts?
I have not tested that, so I don't know the answer to that. I think that in general, it's a positive thing. Obviously, what we got the biggest response from is sharing the life stories of other people who had made that kind of a commitment. Now, in that case, you're just listing the names. It would seem to me that that should have a positive effect, because, of course, we're saying, look, here's other people who have made this this kind of commitment, this kind of decision. But given that we know that the decision-making process is one of visualized autobiography, I've got to believe that the effect is going to be even more powerful if, in addition to that list, you're going to do a couple paragraphs of someone who's willing to share their story of why they are giving, or to share the story of how that gift that they have planned will continue to make an impact long after they're gone. So I think it's a good idea. I haven't tested it. I think it would be an even better idea if you combined it with even brief biographies or stories of people who had made those kinds of commitments, and in particular emphasizing how those gifts would continue to have an effect after their death. So that's the symbolic immortality side of it.
Okay, wonderful. And I think we have time for one more question here. When a potential donor is engaged in a discussion about bequest giving through your sugarcoating approach, wouldn't the initial avoidance reaction resurface later when more literal discussions about the bequest itself are raised?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think it's kind of this issue that uh, it can come back up again. So when do we have situations where it doesn't come back? Well, we have situations it doesn't come back if avoidance isn't an option. So, for example, if someone is in a context where they've maybe just had somebody die recently, or they've had a recent diagnosis with an illness, they want to get it done.